players in the story have very well documented lives, I was able to get Olauda's book. I was able to get Granville Sharp's memoir. I was able to get Otterber's. I was able to get some stuff on Mansfield. I was able to go to the Maritime Museum and look at the actual transcript. So I sort of started to I wanted to piece together as much of the story as I could verbatim and then see where the gaps were. And then maybe I would have to write a little bit to sort of fill in some gaps. So as the process moved on, then I got to a point where I thought, actually, you know what? Fuck it. You're just going to have to actually, you're going to have this on you. You're going to have to write this. This is your bit of the story to tell. So it has been a long process. And I think part of it, that whole process was very much part of what the story is and how Olaudah and Granville initially went about trying to tell this story. It's about the process as much as it is about the result. So yeah, it's been a long process and a difficult one, but definitely worthwhile.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say about, Olaudah Equiano. I mean, I was very grateful for this additional piece of work. My introduction into it was through my brother when I was really, really young, and he told me about Equiano and that actually it's important who writes the history and it's important to engage with slave narratives. Yeah. And I just thought that was revelatory. So then to come across this piece of work that you did, did you feel that this was another means of encouraging people to engage with history from a different perspective?
Yes, very much so. And yeah, because that's why I wanted to make it a piece of theatre, really. So it's live and you are in front of the people who you are talking to and they can hear you, and it is a two-way conversation, which I think is very important dealing with this subject. We know what our experience is. Your brother could tell you how this all works, and our parents tell us how this all works, and we know what we have to deal with, and we know what we have to see them deal with. But actually, the conversation, the fact, I wanted I want to engage in the story, or the situation, the conversation, which is not just about the people who pulled down the statue of Colston, but the people who put it up in the first place. And to me, that's actually a very important thing. It's not just, which is always why I try and resist the idea, when people say, oh, this is a black play. I say this is a play about British society, and this is something that we're all involved with, which is something I found really important when researching. I never found that. The only place I found that was in Marcus Rediker's books, which is why it's amazing that he's able to join us this evening, because when you're looking at a situation within a community, within a society that has lots of different components, and all those components are involved in creating the thing, and all those components should be involved in finding the solutions to the thing. So to me, that was very important. The idea of looking at a story which says, what is the individual's responsibility towards the society they're in and the situation that they find themselves in? And because I don't think necessarily that theatre is, going to make an entire audience get up and run out onto the streets and riot and protest. Sometimes it does, but what it can do is speak to the individual and say to an individual, actually, other people have been here before, other people have been through this. I have a right to my feelings and my thoughts in a very sort of private way. So this story spoke to that. So a lot of the characters in it, I really wanted to take the situation and take a handful of characters in the story from a cross-section of society, from the highest, Judge Mansfield, all the way down to the people who experienced this Middle Passage, and including the sailors, and see how they're all affected by this as individuals. So that an audience could come to it and say, I could sit in an audience and say, well, I have more in common with Judge Mansfield, or I have more in common with Annie, the shorthand secretary that they take in, or I have more in common with Olaudah. And for an audience to really be taken care of, no matter who they were. So it wasn't just a specific section of society, but it's for all of us.
And I was going to say, because we'll get into the details of the actual story that's told, which is really powerful. But the starting off point, the launching point for it, is a very everyday encounter in a shop. And I just thought it was a really interesting way into it. And it addresses the fundamental question, literally, in a literal place, which is, where do you place the history? It's in a bookshop. It's a literal, where do you place it? And I thought it was a really clever piece of writing and design to address that about, do you place it on the shelves in Africa? Do you place it with slavery? Or do you place it with British history? What was the process of going through that? Was that just a natural thing that you thought that has to be the starting point, or did you think it through really deep in terms of, no, this would be really good?
Yeah, that was a sort of an addition which came to fairly recently. As I say, the process I've been writing it for a number of years, and some of it has remained as the way it initially was, and some of it has grown and changed, and we've moved things. How best to tell this story to an audience now, and that was one of the things that opening scene was something which is, in terms of the play's history, has come fairly recently. It's a situation I've been in, and it's primarily, I think, about the acknowledgement of this history, the acknowledgement of this country's history, which has to be, that's a sort of reckoning that has to be made, I think, if this society is going to survive and move on and be a healthy society. So to me, it was about, yes, it's about where you place it, but it's also about just acknowledging and owning the history that we have experienced in this country.
And the neat trick that you do is to use history to address contemporary issues. So there's several points within the play where you are dealing with issues of to do with protest and Black Lives Matter. You deal with issues to do with the George Floyd situation. You have the line, "I can't breathe." There's a number of times where you use lines that perhaps people would recognize: "No justice, no peace." I mean, and that's in terms of doing that, were you thinking, actually, this is the vehicle I can use to help people engage with issues today in a way that they perhaps wouldn't have thought that they would want to engage? Does it disarm them that they're listening to a historical piece and then suddenly realize, no, actually he's talking about something that's very current?
Yeah, that's a good question. I kind of started from the point of going, right, I want to devise this piece, and I want to be able to take it not just to a very sort of clued up, turned on progressive audience. I want to be able to take this story into to the people who haven't heard it. So I want to take it into schools. I want to take it into universities. I want to be able to take it in prisons. So I knew that I wanted to tell it in a way which is very sort of movable around, wasn't dependent on a huge amount of set, so that you could actually just try and take this story to people who would most benefit from it. So I wanted to definitely try and make it speak to people in a very contemporary way, where people could say, actually, this is about my life, as opposed to some history lesson, which has happened hundreds of years ago and has nothing to do with me. The whole point of the story is that it's all linked. What happened in the 1780s directly we are playing out now, whether it's the royal family, whether it's Lloyd's of London, whether it's the BBC. It's all has its, whether it's the idea of human rights, civil rights, the idea of women's rights. All of that stuff happens at this point in this decade, 1780s. So it was very important to go, right, how can I tell this story in such a way that people recognize it as their own lives, as connection to their own lives? That said, a lot of the stuff that you've just mentioned was actually in the play before 2020. And in a way, what's been sort of interesting, like I remember when the first time Tom and I spoke after the murder of George Floyd, Tom said, well, that line, "I can't breathe," sort of jumped out to him. And in a way, it's a kind of validation of the sort of hunch that I had, which was, I just want to write about things that I recognize and I've experienced. That situation that Alauda goes through, down on the docks was I went through that situation. That was something that happened to me. So I wanted to definitely write about stuff that I'd experienced and that meant something to me. And then hopefully if it meant something to me, then it means something to other people. That was definitely a very important aspect to me, to be able to teach to be able to tell something that wasn't like a history lesson, but that was a kind of present lesson.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask you a question, but I want to then broaden it out just to ask the director and the other producers, and it's about that process, because this was a collaboration. You know, you've got you as the writer, you've got a director, but you've also got a radio producer. I sense that radio producer too. And in collaborations, that's always tricky, because you then have to work creatively on the narrative and control of that. So how did you find it? And then I'll ask Tom and I'll ask Jonquil as well about that process of you know, collaborating to produce this work.
Initially, I knew that I started out wanting to make something that was very collaborative, so that as many people as possible, you know, because I think it's about a group of people who contribute to a specific conversation situation. So I that's how I wanted to go about making this. So I was kind of I've always sort of been open to that. The difficulty then comes when you if you're writing about something which is historically fact, you then have to be you have to tell a story in such a way that makes sense to you as a writer doing it. So it's a valuable lesson in terms of, one, just looking at the pure narrative beats of a story, dramaturgy. I hate that word, dramaturgically, but looking at literally what the story is doing and how the thing is working and what makes sense where and when, and then also trying to balance that with telling something which honors the initial impulse that I had when this story spoke to me, because I knew that I'm telling a story on behalf of people who are not here. I'm telling a story on behalf of people who had their voices removed, and through subsequent centuries have had their voice removed and their experience removed. So it comes with a huge amount of responsibility to try and honor that first and foremost, and at the same time trying to balance it with the sort of ABC of trying to tell a story. So to me, it was all useful, really, as much sort of bouncing back and forth between very skilled, experienced minds and sensibilities is just can only make the story better, which is slightly different on stage. We wrote this initially to be a stage play, where the role that Jonquil had as a producer would be slightly different. Whereas here, it was like we had, well, she and Tom kind of directed it as well as me having my input. So it's kind of useful to have all of those kind of sensibilities to try and fashion the thing in this instance.
So it'll be good to hear from you, Jonquil, because obviously you've got theatre and you've got radio, and you've got to make it fit almost for two worlds. How did you find it?
Well, it was sort of, I think all collaboration takes time. All collaboration takes extra work, whether you're collaborating with a different form or between genres. I mean, the collaboration with factual producers as a drama producer, even within audio, takes, you know, extra discussion and extra effort and extra generosity from everybody. But that it always brings you, I hope, a richer experience. And certainly as a maker or as a producer, it's a fascinating experience and one that you always learn and grow from, I think. And certainly in this case, the minute I read the script that was Radio 3 sort of got in touch with me as a locally based producer, and I read Giles's stage script, and I loved the richness of it. I loved the ambition of it. I loved the contemporary and totally accurate historical feel of it. It was just so ambitious. It was just such a big big epic enterprise that existed in different time zones and held all of this together. And I could see absolutely it was a big company stage show. That's how it looked to me. I could see exactly how with Giles and Tom to produce it on stage, that exactly, not exactly, because Tom knows a lot of stuff I don't know, but I could imagine where it might go. But also my audio ears were twitching because there was a lot that we could work with, but there are other big issues that we had to think about as well. But I think whenever you move something in form, even a stage script which seems quite simple to bring into audio, I mean, audio is it's verbally based. It's less of a jump, I think, than film, in the sense that it tells its story through words one way or another. There are other elements, obviously, but it's one linear verbal journey normally, that hopefully it allows you to hold sort of parallel worlds in your imagination simultaneously. But nonetheless, you've got to go on a linear journey with it, particularly with audio, because there's only one stream to follow at any one time. So to go from stage to audio is not, you wouldn't think that would be such a leap as to go from something like filmmaking, which carries much of its content to an image. But actually every form, I think, you always find this way, I think, when you translate from one form to another, even something that seems simple, there are new, you end up making something new. You make a new form of the piece. And the interesting thing for me is that I got to be the first audience of the possible audio version. Giles had worked on the piece for a long time. Tom had worked with him for a long time, and there had been various developmental processes. And for both of them, in different ways, it already had a sort of future reality or a stage, in the way that you do when you work on a creative piece, in whatever form you work. You hold the sort of the world of the possible world that you have talked about and worked on together. It has a sort of reality for you. You picture it, you see it on your imaginary screen, you hear it in your imaginary ears. So it had this sort of, it already existed in at least one stage form in Giles and Tom's head. And it was my job to sort of come in and find and just bring ears and try not to see that show, and try to be ruthless about what ears would do, and find the line through where we could honor all those worlds and all that richness, and not sort of say, for example, allow the complexity and the language and the immediate sort of easy dramatical hit of the court material, not allow that to push out the African characters, not allow that to overbalance the worlds which would be perhaps harder to make us a picture of, simply because we don't have the whole picture. So it was complex, but highly enjoyable, and it was it was fantastic to work with two such great, generous collaborators.
And just quickly, because there's certain things that would work on stage that might not work on radio, did you hit any of those points?
Well, I think it's the very thing that made it so attractive and adventurous, which was the coexistence of Amma's world and Amma's time period, which is not Alauda's time period, it's a few years beforehand, and the journey that she goes on, her coexistence with Alauda's own journey towards his unblocking his own past and connecting with and bringing everything that he carries into his actions. Obviously, on stage, there was an idea that characters from the Zong would be witnessing what was going on in Alauda's life, that they would be visually present, and presence in audio. That's quite presence in continued presence like that, or witnessing presence. It's very hard to sustain it. because unless there is sound, unless there is a restatement of that presence, it goes from our mind. The pictures we're making are the ones that are being triggered by the words, by where we think we're going next. That's a great power of audio, of course, because you only know the pictures that the writer allows you to have in your head, and then it's possible to point out that you have made assumptions or to subvert your journey. But that presence, which became a voice in Alaud's head that he, or Gustavus originally's head, that he didn't understand, and then unpacked its existence, but also hung beautifully with this co-presence in each other's lives that was in the book ending of the play. That took a journey of finding how to use that voice. And actually there was some brilliant aperçus from Giles once that started rolling, of how to then use that voice elsewhere in the script, elsewhere in what would have been a different sort of stage play. So yeah, there were quite a few changes, but in the end, when you hear it, it's absolutely that play.
Yeah, and worked well. Just quickly, Tom, from your perspective, and obviously working in collaboration, who ultimately has control of the narrative, for instance?
That's a very good question. I'll try to be brief because there are so many brilliant questions coming in. But for me, this has been a fantastic and quite a long journey. In theatre, the director tends to sort of take over everything and just spend his whole time, or her whole time, telling other people what to do. In this case, I was essentially being taught by Giles very, very patiently that my job here was actually nothing to do with my point of view. It was about his point of view, and I had to listen and learn from him through the different versions of the play that he was writing. I actually really love the way that he's written the character of Granville Sharp in the play, because Granville Sharp agrees to help Alauda and then keeps making mistakes. And I think that's my role on the project, is to essentially keep making these mistakes and then learning and moving forwards. And it's been a fascinating journey of discovery. Just while I'm talking, I'm going to pick up a question which is in the chat, which is someone called Chris, I think, who said, what does a producer in radio actually do? Basically, the producer in radio designs the whole sound world that you hear. It's like a combination of the director of photography and the director of a film. And most radio plays don't have a director at all. My role in this was really to be the person who'd been carrying the project with Giles and worked with many of the brilliant performers on workshops or readings before, and to hold that work. And Jonquil and John Nichols, who did the sound design, between them were then shaping the sound world that you hear. So that's my brief answer, Tim, so we can deal with some of these exciting questions.
Yes, I just wanted to put just a couple of quick ones to the cast, and thank you, Gloria, for joining us as well. Good to see you.
Hey, Gloria.
Joining on, and just to encourage the panelists to jump in if they would want to. There are several very powerful moments in the play, and if I can just come to you, Ronke, first, because in terms of when the enslaved people are thrown overboard, and obviously it's grim, it's really grim, but we have the powerful moment of the one woman who rises from the depths, grabs a rope and manages to get back onto the ship. And just wanted to understand how you play that kind of role. I mean, it was just amazing. And your link might have gone down, I think.
Oh no, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, great. This internet connection anyway. That was such a horrific moment, that part where Emma's thrown overboard and then she's rising. I mean, to get it's beautiful and horrific. It's horrific that something like that is done to her, but it's beautiful that she rises, that she manages to conquer, manages to come back. And a lot of really getting into that mindset was just allowing myself to know the truth of what she was facing. So, you know, just researching, I mean, not that I didn't know, but just researching images, what people faced when they were on ships, really thinking of the conditions and being in that place. And even though you're in a recording, you really allow your mind to imagine those circumstances, you will be there. And also physically, you know, imagining you're in the water and the way you're breathing informs how your thoughts come and how your speech pattern is. So that's what I did to get into that place, to really do service to Amma, you know, and what Amma went through.
Yeah, thank you. And actually it picks up on a point that Heather Hodges has asked, and she cites a number of the characters through it. But she asked the question that says, did the actors call upon personal memories or the idea of blood memory as they developed their characterizations? And you know, have any of the actors visited a plantation or an African slave fort? I just wondered whether, I'll just go around briefly and just touch to see if other people have views on that. Akia, is that something, did you draw upon it for characterization? Have you visited any of the seminal places?
Yeah, I mean, like, interestingly, with Bristol Old Vic, I did visit, we went to Charleston for the Spoleto Festival. And our hosts were really, really lovely and generous. And Tom is now going to squirm, but I won't tell Tom's story. I'll keep that to myself. But yeah, there was a day, actually. I had a really kind of weird experience. So when we got off the plane and we were heading to our accommodation, and everyone was commenting on the beautiful architecture and everything. And I felt inside, my stomach was twisting. I felt really weird and really uneasy. And I saw a friend of mine who lives in Charleston, and I told her about the experience. And she was like, it's because you're sensing your ancestors. And we all decided to go to visit a plantation. And we arrived, and I couldn't even make it through the door because I felt sick. I felt it just didn't feel right that an establishment was making money off the back of my ancestors' blood. So everybody else went, and I ended up jumping in a taxi and going back home because I just couldn't do it. So it's interesting, this thing about drawing on experience, but also doing your research. And I think, obviously, as a black woman, and growing up and experiencing institutional racism, you know, it's not difficult to kind of draw on personal experience to add to the character. And also as well, you know, we spend a lot of our time, even not as actors researching, but just in terms of as Black people wanting to understand our history and wanting to understand our ancestral trauma and our ancestors that came before us, you know? So I've spent a lot of time, as I'm sure a lot of other people have on the panel, learning and reading about our history. So when you get a great play like this, all of a sudden you find yourself kind of drawing on all of this knowledge that you've gained from childhood up until adulthood, you know, to be able to then tell this story in the most beautiful, authentic way.
I mean, I understand your reaction to visiting some of those sites. I went to Gorée Island in Senegal, wow. and it is whatever you think you are and however strong you think you are, it is a powerful moment and stops you short in whatever you're doing. Gloria, did you draw upon similar experiences, visits, as was asked?
No, not really. I think for me, I kind of just thought of it as the people who were taken could have been my cousins. So I thought of it more as long lost family that was taken kind of situation, and just sort of put myself in that mindset of how to humanize them and give them personality. Because I think, unfortunately, in a lot of instances where these situations are portrayed, we're not always portrayed as people, usually just as victims. And you don't get to see the people, who they were, what they loved, like the little things of, are you an early morning riser? Are you a night owl? Like things like that. So for me, it was more just about how to humanize them, and I guess who could have been who, and so on and such forth, if that makes sense. Yeah.
No, I understand that you relate it in a way that means something to you. Michael, did you draw upon it for your characterization?
Sorry, can you say that again? Sorry.
I was just saying, because the question that was asked was about drawing upon those experiences for your characterizations, and whether you visited any places in terms of the research for the role to help you with that.
I didn't visit anywhere like to research the role or anything like that. I feel like, most Black people living today have seen and have read, many literature about slavery and about what happened. And, I think for me, I feel like the main thing for me was just understanding that this is just another miscarriage of justice. That's what this story is about. And, we don't have to look far to see miscarriages of justice throughout history around these very subjects, even today. So, those experiences aren't really hard to sum up.
Mm. And you say you relate it to today. Interestingly, we've had a question from Heidi, who asked this question. She said, it's a really interesting day to be having this conversation after the report by the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, stating that the country is not institutionally racist. So she wants to ask this to the whole panel, what their reactions are to this news today. So that's quite something published today, and saying that there isn't institutional racism. Giles, you wrote this, and we said at the beginning that there's a historical reference, but it's very relevant to today. What's your reaction to that?
I don't need to hear the result of the report to know what that result is going to be. I know what our establishment, I know the narrative that our establishment needs to put forth in order to be able to carry on any number of like atrocities that are going on in our society. So for me, it's like, I know what this country is. I know how, you're talking about research. I know what I have to experience between my front door and then getting to work, as we all do. Like a million micro things that you have to just deal with and you have to be aware of constantly. So I know what our society is. I don't need Boris Johnson to tell me what our society is. And in a way, I would be surprised if their sort of summation were otherwise, knowing what I know about our government. But I think for the people in our story, for Granville and Alauda, I think they would have had a similar day when they looked at the Morning Chronicle newspaper and read what the result of the first trial was. That same sense of, what the fuck are you talking about? Are you insane? It's like, this is insanity. And so again, along the way in this process, one always comes up against situations where I thought, that's this feeling that I'm going through must be very, very similar to the experience that they had in this story. So one tries to use that to be able to say that, that my lived experience is wrong, or is bullshit, or is not valid, or is incorrect, is to me insanity. Let me let other people speak.
I think we sense your reaction and frustration towards it, Giles. Moronke, what was your reaction to the news today?
it just it just made me it just made me laugh, because like Giles said, you don't need a report to know what the report was going to say, but you can't tell me that that's truth when I'm experiencing something different. You can't tell me that when people are being treated differently because of the color of their skin, there's no institutionalized racism. You can't tell me that when I go to set as an actor, I always have to bring my makeup bag in my bag, because almost certainly my shade is not going to be there. And other people who are of fairer skin colors, who are white, there's always something for your skin. I have to bring something for mine. You can't tell me there's no institutionalized racism when you're going to take a smart black boy or smart black girl and place them in the lower set. For what reason? So that's why it's laughable, because we see it. And I think it's really sad that like in the time of The Meaning of Zong is set, it's sad that there are people who believe, wow, this is true, because they're not around people. And it just shows how dangerous it is to be in a place where you don't see people who are of a different skin tone, of a different socioeconomic background, because it allows you to believe, oh, this is what the world is. And it's like, it's really not.
Just in fairness to Tony Sewell, who was the chair of the commission who produced the report, he did an interview today where he seemed to be suggesting that the headline takeaways that people were taking from the report were not the full story, and that the way in which it's being presented is perhaps not the conclusion that that he would want people to take from it, and he's very much keen for people to see the recommendations that they've made going forward. But I'm not here to answer for him. I just put that into the mix because he did do an interview, and it might be worth people catching up with the interview that he did. Sorry, Giles, you wanted to say something?
Well, no, I think one has to be, there's an obligation to be unequivocal about what is in your report, so that you don't leave room for that kind of misinterpretation. Again, going back to this story, the 10 years before the Zong case, there was a case of James Somerset, big case, was presided over by Judge Mansfield. Granville Sharp was there, and James Somerset was brought into this country from America, I think, or Jamaica, and he ran away from the man who claimed to be his owner. It ended up in court, and there was a huge trial about it. And Mansfield was very, very specific about trying to be vague about whether this man, James Somerset, could be taken out of the country with the man who claimed to be his owner. And interestingly, I mean, Marcus will probably be able to talk about this better than I can, but interestingly, Judge Mansfield sat. It's a very similar situation. Judge Mansfield, representing the establishment, that, you know, quote unquote, sat on his hands for months, 3-4 months, trying to come up with this verdict, which would, on one hand, speak to the very obvious human rights he was dealing with, but on the other hand, not damage the slave trade, which was of ultimate importance. So he worded his verdict in such a way which could do with both. So I think there's a kind of history of kind of, you know, it comes back to controlling the narrative, of wording things in such a way that they can be used in this instance and they can be used in that instance. So I think you know, ultimately, as Moranke says, you have a situation where a lot of people, I think, because, you know, as the two of us have just said, we know what we feel, but for the white members of our white brothers and sisters in this society, we'll be able to look and go, okay, fine, it's all right, it's fine now. Because we're always looking for, as they were in The Meaning of Zong, a way out of actually being able to face the reality of what we're actually dealing with. So I think the danger here is that those headlines that were taken will be taken and be used to make a lot of people turn away from the reality of the situation.
And you, as you say, Marcus may have a perspective on this, but I just wanted to ask a couple of things, Marcus, because obviously the play starts with someone trying to position your book on the shelves in the right sections in a shop. And Ian asks a question on the Q&A where he says, Yes, we have to acknowledge our history, but should we be responsible for it over 200 years later? So there's, you know, from your perspective, Marcus, there's the right positioning of history, where do we place it? And there's the secondary question about whether people should feel responsible for it 200 years later.
Yes, thank you, Tim. And let me just say in the very beginning that it's an honor to be here with this creative group of people. I admire this production very much. I think it's powerful, it's timely, it's deep, and I really warmly congratulate you on what you've been able to produce. I think several important points arise from this discussion. One is that, you know, Giles has reminded us of a truth about British history, which is that a lot of it has happened overseas. And quite a bit of it has actually happened on the seas, as in the case of the Zong. And I would say, you know, my view of this is that ships like the Zong, the slave ships, especially those from Britain, the human reality that they created and the economic legacy that they created live with us every minute of every day.
Amen.
And let me just give you some of the basic ways. They live on through discrimination, through deeply entrenched poverty, through structural inequality, through racialized incarceration, and maybe most importantly, through premature death. And I think that that the way this play captures that reality of premature death is a really powerful thing that resonates broadly. And so in my view, we still live with this history. We still live with the wealth created by this history, and people in the present definitely have a responsibility to deal with this part of the past, because they live with both the advantages and disadvantages that the slave trade created. It is radically present in our lives, no matter how much time we spend denying it.
And thank you for that, Marcus. I was just going to ask, because part of that question was, are you responsible? You seem to be saying very clearly, yes, 200 years later, people are responsible. Do you think that we position it right, which was the starting point for the play, in terms of our teaching of history?
Well, I think that one of the things that's very frequently said in the US is that Black history is American history. And if historians have learned anything over the last 50 years, it's that the histories of slavery and race are absolutely central to American history. And I dare say they're central to British history as well. So I think that this is really crucial. But let me make one slightly different point, Tim, if I may. One of the things that I've long come to see in working on these issues of slavery and the slave trade is that the perpetuation of injustice depends upon some degree of abstraction, so that people can look at the slave trade and say, yes, it was terrible, but it's different understanding that statement than hearing the terror that is evoked in the meaning of Zong. In other words, it makes the terror concrete. It allows us, as the actors have explained, to access the human dimension of this story. And I think that's really very difficult to do, but that's another thing about the play that is so valuable. It puts people in that place, and therefore I think challenges us in very concrete ways to come to grips with the history.
And Desmond draws a sort of direct sort of connection between the play and today. He asks, how does today's report saying that there is no institutional racism affect the panelists? And how do we grab the rope and pull ourselves from the depths of despair? Michael, what's your take on the report and perhaps the connection with the play?
Yeah, I think the report is just, I think when you ask a group of people to analyze their own institution, it's very easy to, you know, to come up with some kind of answers. I think it's a similar thing. I mean, sorry to bring up, but the whole, you know, the thing that happened with Sarah Everard, you know, I think the police commission, they looked into it and they said that, you know, the vigil that happened the other day in Clapham, and they looked into how some of the women were handled, and they came back and said, oh, you know, there was no excessive force used. And then, you know, this thing comes out about, you know, is there institutional racism? And they turn around and say, oh, there is no institutional racism. But it's because it's the very people doing the thing that are actually the same people who are analysing, who are the kind of ombudsman, you know? And so, yeah, you know, I don't know what to say about it, to be honest with you, man. It's just the way the world works. And this is the world that we all know, which is why we're still telling these kinds of stories, you know? And I think it's quite clear to see how it relates to the play, because it's, like I said earlier, it's a miscarriage of justice that keeps kind of replaying itself out through history because things aren't dealt with. And the reason why they keep rearing their heads in history is because they still haven't been dealt with, which is why we're telling the story. So that's the reason why 200 years later, you know, we're still telling these stories, because we're still suffering with the very same issues that they were suffering everyone's on the boat Zong. And that's just how it is.
Thank you for that, Tom. I just wanted to ask you, because one of the things as someone new to the play that surprised me was it was a story of callousness, but it was followed by an insurance scam, essentially. So you had this massive callousness of chucking people overboard to their deaths, but it rests on a court case where people claiming compensation for the very people they'd thrown overboard. I mean, how do you get your head around something like that?
One of the things that I really like about the route into the story that Giles has found in his play is that he starts with Equiano, who's then called Vassar, reading about it in the newspaper and deciding to go and talk to Granville Sharp. And of course, they're scandalized by the murders that are being reported. And they're scandalized by the process of law, which is happening, which is based on an idea of ownership, which actually everyone knew was wrong. This is one of the myths, is that people in some way didn't know it was wrong. Of course, they knew it was wrong. And what, in Giles's play, what Equiano realizes is that these things are going to have to be described in public in order to deal with the insurance case. And the mere fact of these things being described in public is going to show the grotesque moral disproportion between the law, which treats a human as a possession, and the reality, which is that all humans are equal. And that allows, if you like, the scandal to begin to breathe and be understood, and in Giles's word, to make the people shudder. And from that shudder, a change can happen. But, you know, listening to this really interesting conversation and the questions as well, for me, Ian's question about, you know, whether we're responsible for it, the responsibility is of a particular kind, because what was happening in the 1780s is that people who clearly knew and understood that this was a grotesque moral wrong, this whole economic system was wrong, and they knew it. They talked about it in Parliament. Ordinary sailors talked about it. They knew it was wrong, but they swept it under the carpet because of the economic benefits. And that is something that a society learns. A society learns to sweep its moral sensibility under the carpet for economic benefit. And that becomes a habit. And that is the habit that is still with us in various ways in our society now. That's what we need to unlock. That's why certainly the headlines, and according to Des, who's read the whole report and reporting on it in the chat, that's why the report is so depressing, because it is once again sweeping our own moral sensibility under the carpet for convenience.
And I'm sure we'll get some of the questions about that. One of the amazing things that was revealed in the play, Giles, was this sense of scale and the idea that the compensation, I think there was this idea that it was the biggest bailout before bailouts became popular. You have this sense of a bailout of the slave-owning people, and the amount that it's calculated at is 16 billion. Is that right, Giles? And again, in writing that, is that something is very prescient because of what's happened with the coronavirus. But you're taking doing that because it's not something that people reckon with, is it really?
No, I mean, that's part of the whole legacy question, is whether this is something which happened 200 years ago, or whether it's something we're still dealing with. As Marcus rightly says, we benefit from all of this, all those decisions that happened then, whether they be the idea of human rights or whether they be the idea of these enormously wealthy families and legacies, businesses that get set up. So for me, again, we're used to, on this subject, dealing with a certain amount of the narrative up to a certain point. I found time and time again, when I was trying to research all of this stuff, myself constantly hitting brick walls about certain people that I was researching, certain English people, British people, businessmen, slave traders that I knew had some connection to a voyage that I could find in the transatlantic slave trade database, and not being able to match the two up because information wasn't there. So the process became having to continually kind of keep digging, keep scouring the internet, until finally you find that connection. And then after a while of that, you say, why am I continually finding bits snipped out of the record? Which is why we don't hear about these stories, because very specifically and carefully, bits of information just aren't there, so the links aren't there. So I think it's very important to try and tell the whole story all the way through, as opposed to saying, okay, well, William Wilberforce, emancipated the slaves, quote unquote. William Wilberforce ended it. Whereas actually then what came after that? Actually, what came after that is, okay, well, we'll get rid of slavery if you compensate us so that we're not losing out. So I think the whole story has to be, you have to follow the whole story through. Again, going back to Marcus's book, which was very influential to me, because for the first time, I bought all of the books I could on the British slave trade, and time and time again, I would hear, you would just see the word slave. 132 slaves. The slave did this. A slave was said to do this, which to me is wrong. Marcus talks about enslaved people, and for the first time, I was able to see actual human beings, as Gloria mentioned, people who you could tell where they were from, what language they were, how they laughed, how they moved, how they danced, what temperament they had. And all of that I found in Marcus's book, because he'd done the work to be able to, going off the back of like Thomas Clarkson, who was a contemporary of Wilberforce and Sharp, who had gone round the docks. Wilberforce was in Parliament. Granville Sharp was like the elder statesman, and Clarkson was the guy who'd go around the docks collecting information from all the sailors. So you have this wealth of information about specific people, ages, names, where they came from, who they were. And that is something, again, where you don't find that. You don't find that in a lot of books on the transatlantic slave trade. You don't find individual people. So for me, it's important to try and follow through all the time, whatever it is that you get. Because in that way, you can say, okay, well, I can relate to this. This is about something that I can relate to.
Talking about relatability, Alfonso has asked a question, and I'll, because of time, I'll just try and rapid fire go around the cast on it. And he says, I found myself engrossed in the twists and turns of the play, but since Roots has been on TV, I feel that us as a people, we can only identify as descendants of slaves, with everything that flows from that. I don't know if you were old enough to have seen Roots, Akia, but what is your reaction to that?
Thank you, Tim, for that lovely compliment. I did see Roots, both versions. It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think I tend to have a lot of conversations in relation to the stories that we tell in theatre And do I need to see another play about slavery? Because actually that I'm then reliving my trauma. And who is the play actually for? But then I also think that there is a really there is an importance to these stories being told and retold in relation to making sure that we as a society, a collective society, understand that this is a shared history, that this is something that we are all responsible for. So even though, yes, I understand that we are telling stories to, the next generation of incredible Black people, that we are descendants of slaves, it is important for them to understand that. It is important for me to understand that. But I also think it is really important for these stories to be told. So actually, the white members of our society get to understand just how much their ancestors and also themselves are a part of that history too. So I think these stories need to always be shared and told in order for us to be able to take responsibility to change the history and to change the cycle.
And Moronke, I don't know if you were old enough to have seen Roots, but do you feel that we're defined by those
Definitely
characters?
Seen Roots.
Did you say definitely not? I mean, I do remember seeing a snippet when I was in year 11, which was a few years ago. What I think it's really important to know your history. I think something that's been forced down the throat of Black people, African people, is just slavery. And it's like, no, it wasn't just slavery. There was stuff before slavery, there was slavery, and there's us now, and all of it is important, and we can't take any of that away. So it's important to learn about it. But something that is interesting is if you look at the narratives, if you look at what's popular, when you look at films that are popular and box office hits, you wonder sometimes, why is it always the thing where we're suffering? It's like, why does it have to be this 12 years a slave or this? And that relates back to what Ian was saying about responsibility. All of us here alive right now have what we have. And in order to make changes, we have to put our hand in the pot of responsibility and say, what can we do? And something I can do is say, why are we only seeing images of destruction? Why is it my film won't sell if I'm joyous and if I'm happy? And the producers, that's also responsibility. Everyone, producers, what do you want to produce? What stories do you want to see? Directors, what stories do you want to direct? Will you only direct it if it's just gory and bloody XYZ, which is what's so beautiful about what Giles has written. There is pain, but there is beauty. There is dehumanization, but we're seeing humans who have been dehumanized. You've not just said the slave this and there's just crying. There's personality, there's heart. And I think that's something that I've not really realized. When you're so used to a narrative of these XYZ died, you're like, oh, wait, they're real life people. No, like real life. Like you got stolen when you had your first crush, you just learned to make that banging jollof and you were like, do you know what? I'm gonna make it for all my girls in the village. And then this happened. And I went reading it, I was like, wow, we've really been conditioned to think certain things are acceptable. And Giles's play has really opened my mind to see, wow, human life is really important and we have to search for the human in every story we hear.
And Gloria, and you were nodding along and giving a thumbs up to a lot that was said. So I don't know if you have seen Roots and whether you think it defines us in any way, but what's your view?
Like Moronke, I saw Roots during my GCSEs, the clip it, where he's running. But personally, I don't think that we as Black people are stuck in the mindset that all we are is descended from slavery. I don't believe in that. I think the media portrays that, but I don't think we as Black people are. I think personally, I find that a strange comment. But I think the bigger question would be, slavery was a lot worse than what has been depicted in cinema, which is why I think so many people are able to say, oh, well, just get over it, just move on from it. if you watch something like Django Unchained and that unsettles you, because Django Unchained is quite violent in ways, take Django Unchained and then amplify that by 1,000. It was 1,000 times worse. It was pure evil personified. And so I think part of the issue is that a lot of the stories told are arguably black torture porn, where it's Black people on the bottom of someone's shoe. If we had other stories to balance it out, I think people, particularly Black people, wouldn't feel so uncomfortable with the amount of stories told pertaining slavery. I think if the narrative, I think stories around slavery are important because it's not something that can just be glossed over and swept under the rug and just moved on from. People, Black people all across the diaspora have inherited trauma. And if we can acknowledge that trauma can be inherited, I don't understand why it's expected to just move on from it or just ignore it and never tell these stories. If you can tell the story of uprisings, of slaves fending for themselves and taking action and not needing the help of the one white person who felt a type of way. It's like when you watch a movie set in Nazi Germany, Jewish people are not afforded humanity. They're just victims for the most part. And it's often they have to rely on the Good Samaritan, the non-Jewish Good Samaritan to save them, to help pick them up. And it's like, if we had more narratives of us at the forefront, I think people would be forced to see us as people with thoughts and feelings. I think a lot of things. I have to, something like an earlier question was said by Ian in that, but in 1780, slaves were considered property. That was wrong, but it was the law. I have to say, it's a cop-out to say things like, but it was the law at that time. People knew it was wrong. People knew damn well that it was wrong. The Bible was edited to help push the narrative that it was okay. People knew at the time that it was wrong. You can see now, to say that it was the law makes it okay is to say that, well, looking at the way this government has handled the coronavirus, you can simply say, but it's the law, doesn't mean it's right. Doesn't mean it's okay. The 13th Amendment arguably legalized slavery. Doesn't make it okay.
Okay, and I think what you said will give people pause for thought, and the need for more variety, I think, is what you were saying in terms of the stories that we tell. Just wanted to move to another question that was asked, and ask you this, Jonquil, because Monien was asking, will the play be performed in theatres and schools? Of course, we love radio. We think radio makes it accessible to lots of people. But should the play be performed in theatres and schools, Jonquil?
I think and hope that the play will have many future lives, but I'm perhaps not the person to answer the question, as I live here in audio land.
What about you, Tom? Because obviously, with normally in normal times, perhaps definitely theatre, but schools as well.
Yeah, I mean, we were working on it for performance in a theatre. I actually think we've learned a huge amount about the story by doing it on radio first. And it will be enriched from this experience and from the work that's gone into it, and also the responses to it when we put it on a stage. But Giles, we are going to put it on a stage at some point, aren't we?
We better do.
We better do after all this.
And Michael, would you like to see it in schools? Because that's an interesting aspect of it.
Yeah, I think it's a really dynamic way to educate children, you know, with this kind of play. And I think the way that Giles has written it as well, it's quite easily accessible. You know, it's not too, I mean, the courtroom scenes are quite heavy, but I think the way that he's written it, the language he's used, enables all audiences to appreciate it and learn something from it.
And there was another, we've got 5 minutes left, I'm being told. So I'll just ask a quick question from Chloe, just try and get her her back. Chloe had said that she'd seen the play in a reading and wondered how that had affected the production, if I can get it right. Yeah, she'd seen several years ago with a few of her friends. They were blown away by it. It was extraordinary. How did the experience of staging the show before an audience, albeit a reading, impact your approach and the way that you thought about writing the plays? You continued, Giles.
I always think that every time we come to read it or do a workshop performance, that is the performance. that is it. We are telling that story in that particular moment for that particular group of people. So it always is very helpful. The last time we had a reading was at Bristol, and it was interesting that we had a lot of comments about the women on the ship, and that there were a lot of comments from people who saw it that were very interested in that aspect of the story. So it's always about taking people's comments, trying to find the balance between the worlds. I remember saying at the National Theatre, this is not necessarily the kind of story that the National Theatre would want to tell, because it's not the kind of story that the establishment want to tell. And that's difficult because there has to be a balance of the worlds within the play, the African world, the European world, which is not really a conversation that we're ready easily to have. So trying to get that balance is always very useful in readings. But someone asked a question and I can't, it was about what we do. It was about what we do, how our version of hanging onto the rope and what we do. And I think that, you know, I would say that today is a very good example because, you know, you could go to anywhere in the establishment today and ask a question about systemic racism in this country and they'll say, no, everything's fine. This is exactly the situation that Olaudah Equiano was in. He didn't wait for the report to say whether or not this was right or wrong. And Amma on the ship does not wait for any permission to say whether she's going to observe her right as a human being to live. She doesn't wait. And I think that's the key here. It's about the individual's responsibility. We all have a rope in front of us, and we all have to decide whether we want to take it and try and improve our situation or not. And you know, I always come back to something that Dr. King said when he was talking towards the end of his life about what our responsibilities are. And he says, cowardice asks the question, is it safe? And then expediency comes along and asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? And I always try and come back to that. That runs all the way through this story. Is it right? You have a response, you have your own mind and your own heart and your own thoughts. You don't need permission from any report to say really what you feel is right and wrong. Then it's about rolling our sleeves up and kind of going out and doing the work. But first of all, it starts with you as an individual. What do I actually think about this? Never mind what social media or the media is telling me what I think about it. What do I think about it? If I see George Floyd being knelt on for 10 minutes, what do I think about that? If I see Grenfell Tower in flames, what do I think about that? Is it right or is it wrong? That's what Granville Sharp is doing. That's what Olaudah's doing. That's what Amma's doing. All of them in the story are doing that. And therefore, it's about your individual responsibility to act. I think we have much more power than we feel we do, for many of the reasons that we've spoken about here. So I would say that our version of the rope is in front of us every minute of every day. We walk down the street and we see someone, if something's happening and it's wrong, are you going to do something about it or not? Are you going to raise your voice? Are you going to use your platform? All of those things are what the play is about. So if anything, I would like to, you know, very much encourage young people especially to think for themselves and research for themselves and question for themselves. We're in a situation where the very act of questioning could land you in jail for 10 years. So it's even more important now.
And I like the way that you crystallized two things, really. I think you need to share that Dr. King quote so that everybody can hang on to that quote, really important quote for people to know. And the choice that you put before people, because again, at the very beginning of the play, the shopkeeper, the bookstore owner says, "I'm an ally," which is an interesting thing. So choosing to act and be supportive, I'm an ally, but then when push comes to shove, the shop is closing and people are being shuffled out the door of the shop. And I don't know how you view that in terms of the relationship of people who may say, this is not my experience or this is not my fight. How can they make good choices in that scenario and be allies in the truest sense of the word?
We just know, I guess, I mean, maybe other people have, but can articulate better than me, but just know what you don't know. One of the things I like about Tom is that Tom will say, actually, I don't know this. I'm white, I'm Oxbridge, I'm a male, but...
He's calling you out on everything, Tom, I think.
I know, I've got nowhere to hide now.
We're programmed to know and run everything, but actually, there are certain things I don't know. You know, I think it's very easy for us. We have a situation where we can look at George Floyd and say, Christ, I would never do that. And we can take a knee and go out and protest and go, that's really terrible, I would never do that. But actually, we're all tied up in that. We all have a part in that. Even I have a part in that, of course. So I think it's about acknowledging what you don't know and acknowledging what that you might have stuff which is buried that you haven't actually dealt with. I have to do that in terms of gender, in terms of whatever it might happen to be. I have to do that. So I think we all have a part to play in that, of going, actually, let me not just take the government's way out and say, actually, no, it's all fine, but to say, but yet people of color in this over this last years have experienced this. If you just take COVID, there doesn't seem to be any mention of that in the report, of like what we've actually experienced, and sort of sympathy to that experience, acknowledgement of that experience, I think is the first step in being a real ally. And then it's doing the work.
I'll let Gloria.
Sorry.
Let Gloria go first, and then we'll come to you, Akia. Go on, Gloria.
I think with the whole question of, is this my fight? I would very much recommend that people read the poem First They Came. Because for you to say it is not your fight means that when they eventually come for you, there will be nobody to fight for you. And by then it will be way too late. You don't have to be the targeted demographic to think that you should stand up for it. I think a lot of it requires people to decenter themselves from the narrative, look at the people around them, look at their loved ones, their extended loved ones, and think, who is the most vulnerable person in my circle? And how can that circle get closer and closer and closer to me until I become the most vulnerable person in my own circle? Mm-hmm. So that would be my answer to that.
And Akia, you were going to say?
Yeah, just a kind of an extension really of what Giles was saying, but I just think it's a lot simpler than, I think we like, as human beings, we like to complicate things. And I think one of the things that really stands out to me, like when I was learning about slavery as a child, and in particular what this play states over and over again, is that a group of people are being treated like chattel. They're not being treated as human beings. And I sit here and, we all have these conversations about racism, about misogyny, about patriarchy. And I sit here about, economic inequality. And I sit here and I just think, all anybody has to do in the world is treat each other like human beings. You're not less than, you're not more than, we are human beings. And actually, keep that in your mind every single time some form of prejudice seems to rear its ugly head, some form of bias rears its ugly head. Every single time you want to walk down the street and you see a homeless person and you walk past thinking, oh my gosh, that's just disgusting. Why is there a homeless person there? That's a human being. And that is all we are asking for. That's all I'm asking for. It's all I want for my nieces and nephews, my children that may come, my friends, my family, my loved ones, all of you, is that we all see each other as human beings, worthy of being free and alive and present and treated equally on this earth.
Thank you, Akia. That's a great point, which to finish, there's so much in this play. I'd recommend people, if they haven't seen it, to go and listen to it. It's available still on the BBC Sounds and iPlayer for another 20 odd days, I think. So you can catch up with it there.
In fact, it's there for a year.
It's
Tim.
there for a year. Thank you for the direction.
Pass that link around.
So yeah, you can go and let people know, because it's a really important work to listen to. One of my favourite moments in the play is where Gustavo remembers and reclaims his name. It's such a powerful moment. As he remembers and is pushed by Otto, and he remembers and reclaims his name. And I have to confess that I shouted out "Olado Equiano" at the same time as he said it, as he recovered it. And I was saying to Giles before today that it was really poignant, because every time now I fly across the Atlantic, involuntarily I have this moment where I remember the ancestors who had perished in the Atlantic, and I just can't help myself. And I know that Charles said he has a similar experience as he crosses over there, and I think it's the same for many people. Just want to say thank you to everybody on the panel, to Giles Terera, to Akia Henry, to Gloria Albiano, to Marcus Redica, to Moronke Akinola, to Tom Morris, to Jonquil Panting, and Michael Balogun. It's been really good talking to you. We carry on for ages on this. I hope we sparked many conversations that will continue past this webinar, and that you will tell all your friends to really engage with this. Thank you very much, everybody.
And thank you, Tim. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good evening.